you got to be willing to spend money to put fights on at a time like this. So it's not cheap. None of this stuff is cheap, you know, but we're going to keep going. You know, listen, I got over 350 employees with families, the fighters, you know.
10 things you didn't know about the UFC. The UFC has come a long way since its inception in 1993. As hardcore fans of the sport, many like to think they know it all. But trust us, this video will leave you questioning your UFC knowledge. That said, number 10. The Octagon was inspired by Chuck Norris. Starting at number 10, we have the UFC's unexpected connection to renowned legend Chuck Norris. Did you know that the shape of the Octagon was believed to have been inspired by a movie starring Norris? The culprit in this case is assumed to be the 1980 film The Octagon, in which Norris played a crucial role. The film is a super hit amongst MMA fans, and we agree. After all, which movie starring Norris isn't already a favorite for MMA enthusiasts? While the movie itself doesn't feature a fighting stage in the shape of the modern day, it does feature an octagon-shaped platform covered with sand where most of the climactic fights within the movie take place. Jason Cusson, a video and film art director who helped design the fighting ring, was kind enough to reveal the source of his inspiration in an interview with ESPN. Jason had no MMA experience, and watching the film gave him an idea that would essentially go on to become the iconic design we see and love today. While there was another promotion, namely the Cage of Rage, that has used the actual octagon design in their fights before, the UFC was smart enough to trademark the design first, which we have to agree was a pretty smart move. Number 9. UFC 37.5 was the first fight ever aired in the United States.
Hello and welcome to Studio 2A at the Fox Network Center. I'm Joe Rogan and I'm very excited that you're able to join us today for this historic moment for Fox Sports and the UFC.
We all know the UFC wasn't always like it is now. In the early years, it was very hard to imagine the UFC or even MMA in general having such a vast presence. At the time, MMA had a stigma of being animalistic and brutal. In fact, people generally looked down on MMA and MMA fighters, labeling it as barbaric. Of course, we all know now that such a sentiment would soon change. However, nobody can deny the UFC's influence in changing such views and bringing MMA to be viewed as a mainstream sport. Perhaps the first step in this change was UFC 37.5, as real as it gets, on June 22 of 2002. UFC 37.5, headlined by Chuck Liddell and Vitor Belfort, was the first MMA event in history to be aired on cable. There is no doubt in our minds that this was one of the key defining moments of the UFC and MMA in general. That said, the next one is quite a shocker. Number 8. The original UFC 1 had some over-the-top plans.
By way of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, please welcome, out of the red corner, Royce Gracie.
Here it is. There's Eddie's on the ground. Now we're watching Royce take the mount position.
The UFC was originally founded by Art Davie and Rorion Gracie, a Brazilian martial artist. While they would have to sell the business eventually, the owners had very grandiose plans for their promotion. The first UFC event that ever took place was UFC 1 on November 12, 1993. It was hailed as an event with no scores, no time limits, and no rules. However, this isn't why this event is on the list. The original plan was to have alligators inside a moat that surrounded the ring from the outside. Another one of their brilliant ideas was to have an electric fence in place too. Needless to say, all of these brilliant ideas were quickly put down by other people, more sane people. What do you think? Do you think these arrangements would have made for a spectacular show worthy of being the first ever UFC event? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Anyway, number 7. No weight classes?
Can you connect those two on the side?
The original UFC had little to no rules. It was an anything goes kind of fighting contest. That included weight classes. You might even be surprised to know that one of the first matches had an entire 200-pound weight difference between the competitors. In the quarterfinal bouts of UFC 1, Gerard Gordeau at 200 pounds fought against Taylor Tooley, known as Taylor Willie, at 400 pounds. Even despite the massive difference in weight, Gerard would come out as the victor by KO/TKO within the first 30 seconds of round 1. Judging by current UFC standards, such an anomaly would never have been possible today. Speaking of anomalies, the next entry on this list is quite amusing. Number 6. UFC Knockout is the only event in UFC history not to feature a knockout.
You know, big punches and combinations from Rodriguez so far.
Oh, big left, caught the target.
Oh, my goodness!
Pete Rodriguez!
We'd have to say that UFC jinxed itself there. UFC 76, the only UFC event in history not to feature a knockout in any fights, is the one event the organization named Knockout. Funny, right? Well, despite the irony, the UFC wasn't exactly wrong in the naming. Keith Jardine and Chuck Liddell headlined the main event at UFC 76. It also had other superstar strikers such as Anthony Johnson, Shogun Rua, and Jeremy Stevens. Thus, on paper, it seemed as if multiple knockouts were scheduled for the night. Well, now we all know how that turned out, don't we? Number 5. Tallest fighter to ever grace the octagon.
Back, I have any questions? Go to your corners, come out ready to fight.
The UFC has had its fair share of massive fighters over the years. However, Stefan Struve from the Netherlands seemed to be at the top of the list at 7 feet tall. Known for his tall stature, Stefan was nicknamed the Skyscraper. While Stefan would lose his debut bout at UFC 95 against Junior Dos Santos, he would have a pretty good MMA career, accumulating a total of 33 wins and 13 losses. Unfortunately, however, he was never able to win a UFC belt, although he did become the Cage Gladiators heavyweight champion in his career. Now that we've talked about the UFC belt, did you know? Number 4. The UFC belt is actually really expensive.
Championship belt. This is Brandon, our stage manager, and this is the brand new belt. Can we show everybody that? So this is what they'll be fighting for tomorrow night on ESPN. It's pretty nice.
Beautiful.
And I'm not going to lie to you, having just held it for a second, it is very, very heavy.
Very heavy.
Now, this is by no means the first super fight that you have put together.
At first glance, the UFC belt doesn't seem all that extraordinary. However, these belts are actually very pricey and are made of genuine leather and gold or actual gold plating at the very least. The price of the actual UFC belt adorned by fighters can vary according to the number of wins the fighter has. However, the median value of a UFC belt possessed by a champion is around $330,000. Of course, those eager to complete their dreams of having a belt without actually fighting or training can get a gold-plated belt valued at around $1,000. Number 3. The first fighter to wear gloves.
Some people were asking me questions like, why, if I'm a boxer, do I wear MMA gloves? But I gotta tell you, because they have fingers in them, so it's easy to pick things up and do things with that.
Did you know the gloves worn by fighters are meant to protect the fighters themselves? Without those gloves, fighters would often end up breaking their hand from a simple punch, and you can guess, it was gruesome to watch. Sometimes fighters would have to go entire matches with a broken hand or two. While UFC 14 was the first event to make wearing gloves mandatory, another fighter discovered their importance way before the organization had any interest. Melton Bowen fought against Steve Jenham at UFC 4 wearing a pair of gloves. While Melton certainly had a great idea and became the first fighter ever to wear gloves to an octagon, judging from the shape of those gloves, we can only imagine how useful they actually were. Number 2. The UFC was banned in New York.
Why don't you watch it? And I said, what is this no holds barred? He said, just watch it. And I called Bruce right after the fight was over. And I said, you did a great job. I mean, what was I watching? This thing was like a street fight without the beer bottle. And he said, well, you better get ready because it's coming to New York. And my exact words to Bruce were, like hell it is. I said, if they want me to sanction this, it's just not going to happen.
In its initial days, people weren't really keen on the concept of UFC or MMA in general. In fact, many states had a ban on the UFC since they considered it barbaric and akin to human cockfighting. However, the stigma was quick to disappear, and the UFC has come a long way in the last 20 years. However, it may surprise you that the stigma stuck around longer than expected in a particular state within the US. The American state of New York had a ban placed on the UFC. New Yorkers weren't exactly keen on the concept of the UFC, and no matches were allowed to take place within the state. While MMA was considered violent, boxing was deemed safe, and no restrictions were placed on that end of the spectrum. Anyway, the ban was only lifted recently in 2016. And at number 1, celebrities who have bought UFC shares.
Hey, really quick, you're a minority owner in UFC. Conor McGregor wants to be part owner. Do you think that he should be?
I will fight him for his, if he can take me in the octagon.
Oh, okay. So, but Mark Wahlberg said he would sell off his UFC share to make Conor a part owner.
Right.
Would you agree with that? Would you do that for him too?
Well, I'd have to look at the paperwork.
Okay.
I'm all about the paperwork.
Right.
If the paperwork works out,
I love it.
Talk about it.
The UFC is one of the fastest growing MMA organizations in the world. With this meteoric rise, it is only natural that many celebrities want to cash in on the opportunity. A prime example of this would be Conan O'Brien, someone who bought UFC shares well before it was even legal in the United States. Due to that, he's now enjoying a massive return on investment. Other celebrities who own shares of the UFC include Tom Brady, Calvin Harris, Ben Affleck, and more. So what do you think? Did you learn something new about the best MMA organization in the world? Or were you already informed about all the topics covered in the video below? Whatever the case, make sure to let us know in the comment section down below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.